This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hi everyone, it's Jennifer from Flux. In this video, I'm going to show you how to crochet this gorgeous Helen Shawlette. This is a triangle shawlette that we're going to start from the bottom point and work upward and outward until we have this lovely triangle wrap. So we're going to do a series of alternating puff stitches and V stitches to create this lovely textured fabric that we're going to make here. And I chose to make mine in 4 colors and just do sort of a color block effect. So I worked the whole ball of pink yarn, then I switched to the green. I worked the whole ball of green yarn and so forth. So this is a fun cotton cool wrap for the warmer days, or you can wear it as a little accessory when it gets cooler out too. Now the finished piece measures across the top edge where your neck would be and shoulders is 40 inches across. Now up each side here, from the bottom point up this side and the bottom point up this side, each of those sides is 34 inches. And then from the bottom point here straight up is 28 inches. So it's a nice kind of petite size. However, you can work as many rows as you like to make this taller and wider as well if you want it to be kind of like a full-size shawl. This is more of just like a little wrap. You can find this written pattern for free on the blog. You can also get an ad-free PDF of this in my Etsy shop. So let's learn about the supplies next, and then we're going to learn how to make the shawlette, starting from the bottom and working our way up, and I'm going to walk you through it every stitch of the way. Let's get started. Before we get started, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor today, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for anyone who loves learning and wants to explore their creativity and learn new skills. Invest in yourself and your personal growth. If you have a specific skill you're trying to learn, Skillshare is the perfect place to start. From photography and illustration to graphic design, freelancing, and lots more, you can find classes that will match your goals and interests. The class I tried with Skillshare was called Revolutionary Self-Care, Embrace, Nurture, and Grow Your Authentic Self with Chidera. And I learned so much and it was so interesting, and the instructor was very engaging and fun. Explore the Skillshare library completely free for 1 month. The first 1,000 people to use the link will get 1 month free trial of Skillshare. You can explore the entire library and the link is down below. It's the very first line in the info box, so definitely check that out. Thanks, Skillshare. For this project, you'll need a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle. A tape measure is super helpful if you're after a specific size. Otherwise, you can just work more rows of the pattern to make it as large or small as you like, but a tape measure is helpful. We're going to be using a 3.75 millimeter F crochet hook. Now this is my Furl Streamline, the wood. I'll put the link down below and a coupon code if you'd like to get one for yourself. And for our yarn, let me just clear this stuff out of the way. We're going to be using, I'm using 4 balls of baby cotton by Hobie. This is a 100% organic Egyptian cotton. It's very soft and kind of like a fine weight. And I have 4 colors here. This is the gray, or the number 5, color 5, the sky blue, or color 7, the eucalyptus, also called color 10, and the light rose, which is color 11. Now, as you can see, this does come in dye lots. I'll put the link down below for the yarn too. So if you're doing all of one color, you want to make sure your dye lots are the same. When you order it together, they're mindful of that for you. Now, if you need to substitute yarn, just look for, this is a 1 super fine on the yarn weight scale. If you look at your yarn label, you can find a little ball of yarn with a number in it, and this has a 1, so it's 1 super fine. And we're using 744 yards of this total. As you can see, they're small, but because the yarn is fine, you know, there's quite a bit of yardage on here. Each ball of this is 186 yards, and we're using 4 of them. So 744 yards of a 1 super fine yarn for that. So let's get started. So I have my hook and my yarn, and we're ready to go. So you can really do any color combination you like. I'm going to do more of a color block for mine. So I'm going to do an entire ball of one color and then switch to the next color, and then do the entire ball of that color and switch to the next color. So I'll have big wide stripes or like a color block effect. You can start with any color you like. It's completely up to you. I picked the gray out of my palette because it would be a little bit easier to see. All right, so get a little bit of yarn out, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through the sequence together, each stitch, okay? So let me just zoom right in here, and what we're going to do is begin by putting a slip knot on our hook. So wrap the yarn around your fingers to make a loop, bring the yarn behind the loop, reach in with your hook, bring up that loop, and tighten. And this tail will help us as we work through the rows. It'll sort of mark where the bottom of the shawl is, because at first your triangle can sort of seem a little non-triangular looking until you work it up a little bit and it starts to look very distinctly like a triangle, but this little tail will help you in the beginning. So what we're going to do for our starting chain is to chain 10. To make a chain, wrap the yarn around the hook and bring it through the loop. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So here is our starting chain. Then for row 1, what we're going to do in the 4th chain from the hook, this loop does not count that's currently on our hook, but we're going to go 1, 2, 3, and 4 in that 4th chain from the hook. We're going to work a V-stitch. So our V stitches will be a double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. So to make our first V and double crochet, you're going to wrap the yarn around the hook, insert it into that chain, bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through the first 2 loops. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through the last 2 loops. So that's our double crochet. Then we need to do a chain 1. And then in that same chain, we need to do another double crochet to create that V of our first row. Okay? Then what we're going to do is skip 2 chains, 1, 2, and in the chain after that, we're going to work a puff stitch. Now, our whole piece is going to be alternating V stitches and puff stitches. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do each one. So in the chain, we skip 2, and in that chain after that, we're going to work a puff stitch. So to make a puff stitch, wrap the yarn around the hook, insert it into that chain that we talked about. And then what you're going to do is wrap the yarn around the hook and bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, reinsert it back into that same chain and bring up a loop. You'll have 5 loops on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook one last time and insert it into that same chain and bring up a loop. You'll have 7 loops on your hook this time. Now what I like to do, because you have a lot of loops on here, is to kind of grab them at the bottom and sort of wiggle it a little bit. That'll get everything lined up and sort of loosen it up a little bit. Because what we're going to do now is wrap the yarn around the hook and we're going to bring it through all 7 of those loops to create our puff. You might need to kind of wiggle it through there a little bit and bring it through all 7 loops, and then we're going to chain 1 to close the top of that stitch, just like that. Now we have 3 chains left on our row, so we're going to skip 2 chains, and in the chain after that, which is also the very last chain, we're going to work a V stitch once again. Now you notice we did a V stitch, puff stitch, now we're doing a V stitch again. We're just doing alternating stitches here. So in that last chain, work a double crochet, chain 1, and double crochet in that same chain. Okay, so row 1 is complete. Row 1 is kind of like our foundation row that sort of will set us up for the rest of it. Okay, now again, like I mentioned before, it doesn't really look like much right now, but that tail, always make sure it's pointing towards you. It will keep you straight in, you know, understanding where the bottom of it is, because it doesn't really look triangular at this point. Okay, so let's move on to row 2. For row 2, we're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and we're going to turn our work. And then in this first stitch, or this first space, excuse me, was a chain 1 space. Remember with our V, it's the center of that first V that you're going to see on that row. We're going to work a puff stitch into the center of that V in that chain 1 space as it's written in the pattern on the blog. So we're, just to refresh, wrap the yarn around the hook, bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook. Wrap the yarn around the hook, reinsert it back into that V and bring up a loop. You'll have 5 loops on the hook. Wrap the yarn around the hook one last time and bring up a loop. You'll have 7 loops on your hook. I like to straighten mine out. Wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through all 7 of those loops, nice and slow, and then chain 1. Okay, hop over to our next stitch, which was our puff stitch from the previous row. You can see here's our little puff stitch, and at the top, remember where we did the chain 1 to close the top of the stitch? That put a little tiny loop. You can sort of see it right there on top. We're going to work a V right into that topmost chain of our puff stitch. So right in there, it might be a little snug, but it's not too bad. Work a double crochet in the topmost chain of that puff where you closed it tight. Then chain 1, and then in that same stitch, work another double crochet. Okay, and we're just putting that V right on top of that puff stitch. See that? Now, hop over to the next area, which is the center of the next V. You should come to a V, and we're going to work a puff stitch right into the center of that V one time. See, we just worked a V, so now we're working a puff. Just the rule of thumb for this piece is just do the opposite of what you just did, okay? So now hang on, let me just back up because I was chatting a bit and I didn't explain my stitch. Okay, wrap the yarn around the hook, bring up a loop, 3 loops are on the hook, yarn around the hook, bring up a loop, 5 loops are on the hook, yarn around the hook, bring up a loop, 7 loops are on the hook, right in the center of that V. Wrap yarn around the hook, bring it through all 7 of those loops. Might need to sort of wiggle it through there. Oops, I dropped my loop. I got 1 more loop. There we go. And chain 1. Now, we have a turning chain space here at the end. Now you can see our V, because of that chain 1, it sort of pushes that V open. So it kind of smushes up against the turning chain. But you might need to kind of pull it apart a little bit and look at it. But there's our turning chain, and it creates a space in between. In that turning chain space, we're going to finish off the row by working a V, because see, we just did a puff, so we're going to do a V right in that turning chain space. So double crochet, chain 1, and double crochet right in that turning chain space. Just like that. Starting to take shape and open up a little bit, but still helpful to keep that tail pointing towards you as you work. It's not going to look like a whole lot for the first couple of rows, but it will shape up. Okay, for row 3, we're going to chain 3 once again. 1, 2, 3, and we're going to turn our work once again. Now that first stitch that you have here is a V, happens to be a V stitch. So whenever you see a V, you work a puff into it. Whenever you see a puff, you work a V into it. So super easy to remember once you get going. Okay, so that first spot you want to work your stitch is in that chain 1 space that was created by making that V. We're going to work a puff right into that V, okay? So yarn around hook, 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops. We have 7 loops on our hook, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops, and then chain 1, okay? So we just did a puff, so the next one we need to do is a V. So locate that puff stitch because we're going to work a V into it. Remember that little loop at the top of our puff stitch? You'll work your V right into that. Might be a little snug, so just take your time. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet right into the top of that puff stitch. Okay, get my yarn situated here. It's kind of all over the place. Okay, so we just worked a V, so next we need to work a puff. So hop on over to that next V from the previous row, and we're going to work a puff right into that. Once again, 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 of those loops, and chain 1. Moving right along, we have a puff here, so we need to work a V into it. Right at that top loop of that puff stitch, work your V. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, just like that, okay? I'm going to get a little bit more yarn here. All right, now we're at the end of the row. So in that turning chain space here that you see, We just worked a V, so we need to work a puff stitch into that turning chain space. 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops, and chain 1. Okay, so row 3 is complete, starting to look a little bit more triangular. Let's move on to row 4. We have rows 4 and 5 to do still. So for row 4, we're going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and turn. And then our first stitch now, it changes a little bit. So the last 2 rows, rows 2 and 3, were very similar, almost the same, except for it was just a little wider. Rows 4 and 5, we have a puff stitch at the beginning of our row, so we're going to work a V into that puff stitch. Now once again, at the top of our puff stitch, you can see there's a little tiny loop at the top of there. We're going to just work a V right into that, top of that puff stitch, okay? Nothing really new, it's just a little bit different order. Okay, so work our V, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. Whoops, I dropped my loop. Then next, we have come to a V. So we need to work a puff into the V, 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring through all 7 loops and chain 1. Our next stitch is a puff, so we're going to work a V into that puff. So just look at what you're working it into and also what you've just worked so you know what to do next. You don't really even have to remember the rows, you just have to remember to do the opposite, the other stitch, okay? Our next stitch that we see here is a V stitch, so we're going to work a puff into that. 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops. Whoops, I dropped my loop, so let's do that again. Sometimes you got to redo those puff stitches. And if you do a puff stitch, and you don't really like the way it looks, if it looks a little sloppy, you can just pull it apart and redo it. Let's do that again. 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 loops, and chain 1. Now we have a puff stitch here. Remember the little loop at the top? We're going to work a V into that puff stitch, okay? Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. All right, now we just did a V. So in this turning chain space, we need to do a puff stitch into that one, okay? 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 of those loops, and chain 1. It's really shaping up. It's starting to get some beautiful texture. Very interesting looking. Okay, so let's get a little bit more yarn. Now our final row that I'm going to show you is row 5. Okay, let's do row 5 real quick. Row 5 is almost identical to row 4. Okay, we're going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and turn. And then our first stitch again is a puff stitch. So see that little loop at the top of our puff stitch? We're going to work a V into that. So double crochet, whoops, I dropped my loop again. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet right into the top of that puff. All right, now we have a V stitch here, so we need to work a puff stitch into it. 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring it through all 7 of those loops, and chain 1. All right, here's a puff stitch, so let's work a V into that, right at that little loop at the top, double crochet, chain 1, double crochet. Next we have a puff stitch, or a V stitch rather, excuse me, so we're going to work a puff stitch into it. So once again, 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, bring through all 7 of those loops, and chain 1. Here's a puff stitch, so we need to work a V into that. Okay, so as you can see, it's sort of intuitive what you're supposed to do next. You just look at what you just did and you look at what you're working it into and it will give you the answer, okay? Or you could follow the written pattern as well, it's on the blog. Okay, so we just did a V. So here's a V here we need to work into, so we'll do a puff stitch into that. 3 loops, 5 loops, 7 loops, yarn around hook, all 7 loops, and chain 1. Now we just did a puff and we're at this turning chain space once again. So we're going to work a V stitch into that turning chain space to finish off the row. Double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, okay? So we are off to a great start with our little triangle here, and it's starting to get some really nice shape to it and some lovely, lovely texture, okay? So for the rest of your shawl, what you want to do is just keep repeating rows 2 through 5 over and over and over again until your piece is as large as you would like it to be. Now I'm going to keep going with my rows, and you can use self-striping yarn, you can do color block like me, you could do all one color, it's completely up to you. Now if you need to see a row again, because we're doing rows 2 through 5, you can back up the video as many times as you like, and YouTube also has like a slow-mo feature if you need to see it slower as well. So I'm going to keep going with my rows and we'll rejoin in just a few minutes. Just finishing the last stitch of this very last row, and our little wrap is complete. It looks wonderful. I love the color block effect. And I will say, because we increased wider, each one of my color block sections got increasingly smaller because they grew wider. So I thought that was interesting how that played out. So what you want to do just to finish up your wrap is to just cut the yarn, then wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through that loop, and then all you have to do is weave in the ends. So just grab your tapestry needle. I'm just going to get this yarn out of the way here. Grab your tapestry needle, and when you have projects with multiple colors like this, when you weave your ends in, you just want to stay in the same color area, if you will. And so I'm just going to go in one direction with my tail and staying, I have a blue tail, so I'm staying in the blue area here. I'm going in one direction with my tail, and I'm going to come back in the other direction just to sort of lock it into place. So give it a little snip. And then you just want to repeat for all your other tails. So I have some here and then where I changed yarn colors as well. So our ends are all woven in and our little shawlette is complete. So that is how you crochet the Helen Shawlette. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure and click the subscribe button to get all the latest Fiber Flux video updates. Thanks again.